Hey guys, Dave here. Today is the fourth and final installment on the YZ450F motor rebuild. If you've enjoyed this series and you want to watch more like it, consider subscribing to the channel. To keep things simple, I ended up buying a kit from Cylinder Works, which included a new cylinder, piston, rings, and all the gaskets needed to do the top end of this engine. Now it's time to install the piston rings. You want to check not only the end gap, but you want to make sure that none of the gaps overlap with one another, and you have them spaced out appropriately. You can see these lines here each represent a gap. Alright, so we got the final clip in, and the piston is installed, the rings are in the right spot, and we can go ahead and wash the new cylinder from any of the manufacturing debris, and we'll go ahead and install this next. When installing the cylinder, make sure you apply plenty of lubrication to the cylinder wall. This is really crucial when running in a motor, allowing for the rings to mate with the cylinder wall. We finished up the bottom end of this motorcycle, so now it's time to wipe down the workspace, get it nice and clean before we dive into assembling the head. If you remember from the beginning, we completely disassembled the head, making sure we kept each valve and all of its components together. Here you can see I'm pulling out the valve guide seal. We're going to replace that in a moment. Putting assembly lube on the valve guide and a little bit on the valve guide seal. We're going to get this into place with pliers in our finger, and then we're going to take a socket and press it the rest of the way into position. You can see the socket there, just pushing it down. Here we are putting assembly lube on one of the valves and pressing it into place. Again, before reassembly, you want to make sure everything is nice and clean. This valve spring had paint denoting the top side of it, so we'll put that in accordingly. Wipe down the little top hat that goes on top of the spring. Again, putting a little bit of assembly lube wherever we can. We're getting our valve spring compression tool ready. You need to compress the spring in order to drop that little collet you see there into place. A magnet and a little dental pick really help position it. And as we back the tool off, you can see the collet clicks into place, which essentially ties the valve to the valve spring. That one's good. That one's bad, so we got to compress that again and get those two little collets to sit in there. We're putting in the original shims, again with a little bit of assembly lube, and then we'll take the bucket, lubricate that, and put that into place. Now we're in a position where we have to put the head of the motor onto the cylinder and the rest of the bottom end. So we fish that cam chain up through the head, which can be a little tricky. And make sure that it sits in place correctly. You can tap it with a rubber mallet to sit it down a little bit. You can see I'm putting a little anti-seize on the cylinder head bolts and dropping them into place. The instructions call to torque it down, then take the bolts out, torque it down again to a different spec, and then we're going to mark the heads of the bolt with the cylinder head and torque it down based on the number of degrees the bolt turns. So I'll try to show you that. So you see that distance there? We want to go 50 degrees and then another 60 degrees. So we want that to be about over here. You can see it was pretty challenging to hold the motor in place while trying to torque those cylinder head bolts into place. It would have been a lot easier if I had another set of hands or an engine stand. Ultimately, I realized that it would be much easier if you tipped the engine on its side. Now it's time to install the intake and exhaust cams. It's best to install the forward-facing cam first, pull the tension out of the cam chain, and then install the second cam. In this case, it was the intake cam first, followed by the exhaust cam. That way when you install the cam chain tensioner, you have taken up a lot of slack out of that cam chain. Here you can see the dimples on the intake cam and the single one on the exhaust cam. These are to set the proper timing. Now I'm installing the cam caps. These hold the cam shafts in place. And installing the cam chain tensioner, which needs to be in place before checking the valve clearances. Once the top end is totally assembled, you can go and check the intake and exhaust valve clearances. Be sure to write those numbers down in case you have to do the math in order to swap out new shims. With that, I am done building this motor. There's nothing else I can do except put it in the bike. Oh boy, that feels good. Once the motor is in the frame, replace all the fluids, attach the exhaust, the rest of the bodywork, and then the motor is ready to kick over. So I actually finished this like a month and a half ago, so I knew it was gonna start. I had to go back and refilm it for the video. I'm sorry I misled you.